Is that a signal for everyone to turn off their phones or whatever? Well, I wasn't expecting necessarily to see anyone tonight. The weather is so lovely out there, and everybody has so much stuff in their yards to clean up. My daughter was doing mine for a while this afternoon, and I thought, there are going to be a lot of people out in their yards. Lindsay, I thought you would be in your yard, for example, but not a chance. All right, you're here. Good thing. Well, I guess I don't really need those. I think we'll start. I always like to start, as probably everybody knows, and this may be an English teacher thing. I always like to start with a setting. So I always like to make sure everybody knows that we're starting at McCabe's Landing, the original name for Gravenhurst, in 1860. So if you look at the map that's there of the colonization road, you can see at the top, it's actually showing Gravenhurst. So this map must have been made to represent something after 1862, when Gravenhurst was named. But this is a map from Washago to Great Falls, which is Bracebridge. And in fact, we've got all the usual suspects on there: Gibraltar, Malta, Kilworthy, which should have been called Lethbridge if this map is as old as I think it might be. Anyway, that was its original name, was Kilworthy, so this was Lethbridge. Yeah, Gibraltar, yes. That big rock cut on Highway 11, somebody assumed that it looked a little like Gibraltar. I think not, but but there was a man who had a little fortress on the top of that rock, and he had a cannon mounted on it, originally as sort of a do-it-yourself cannon, but then eventually one that was given to him by a passerby later, a very what should we call him, important passerby. And so he would fire the cannon whenever somebody was going up the highway, which was not a highway, but a gravel, well, not even a gravel road. Probably at that point, it was still, a log road. He would fire the cannon off to sort of indicate that somebody important was going by. I'm not sure for whose benefit. I mean, there was nobody else around. But anyway, he knew, because he had fired off his cannon, that somebody important was going by. We're probably all familiar at this point with the first settlers to really be in Gravenhurst. A couple of other names that are south of Gravenhurst, but I didn't bother with them because I confined this mainly to what we call now the town, well, no, not what we call now, to what we would recognize as the boundaries of the town of Gravenhurst. James and Letitia McCabe did settle just outside of Gravenhurst on the colonization road, and eventually then moved up into Greater Gravenhurst, sort of around the spot where the Anglican cemetery is on Muskoka Road. So if you have a bit of an idea where that is, they were sort of across the road from there. And James McCabe actually had land on both sides of that road, and he made available to the Anglican Church that land to make a cemetery and a church there. Joseph Brock came around the same time. Joseph Brock, an interesting man, no end of energy, Joseph. He actually walked from Chelmsford up to Gravenhurst and took a look around and said, yeah, I kind of like the look of this spot. There's nothing there whatsoever, trees, that's it. But he kind of liked, I think probably the fact that there's a lake and there's this nice piece of land in the middle, not too hilly. So he, in fact, put down a little shack on what would be now the Baptist church property, and then took up a land grant of 100 acres, and then walked back to Chelmsford and helped his father with the chores, the fall chores, the harvest, and so on, and then walked back to Gravenhurst in the spring with an ox and a cart, and decided that at this point where that shack was going to be where his home was going to be. And eventually he would go on to marry Mary Brines. This is all McCabe's Landing, which is, of course, James McCabe's name, given first to that little settlement. I've had several people tell me that they wish we had stayed with McCabe's Landing as a name for our community instead of Gravenhurst, which has that gravy sort of sound to it, but grave as opposed to gravy, yes. But in fact, I don't know. I quite like Gravenhurst.
There are a number of other communities around with that landing name.
Yeah, oh,
and
exactly.
spoken.
Yep,
That's
yeah,
what it
yep,
was,
yep.
3 or 4.
Yeah, Landing was kind of a popular name down in the Rideau area as well. There are several communities with that Landing business in its name. A new name, however, was given to us very, very soon, and that was the town or the village being called Gravenhurst, named in 1862 by William Dawson LeSueur. He was quite the man, actually. He was a Canadian man of letters. I put that in there. The Sage of Ottawa was a nickname for him, but in actual fact, he was, without a doubt, quite an intellectual, wrote several books, wrote biographies and histories, read everything in sight, was an essayist. I think I'm going to close that door just because those cute little girls out there are just, I don't want to squash their fun.
Now that you're giving the scoop on the sewer, you don't want everybody out there to hear it.
Well, there you go. You know, I mean, people who don't know this might write it down. Yeah, anyway, he was reading a book called Gravenhurst, or Thoughts on Good and Evil. And I eventually went out and bought that book. And then thought, I'm not sure why he was reading that. Anyway, a book of essays at the time, and people who were intellectuals at this time were quite prone to read many essays. I'm not. Actually, I did it when I was an English teacher. And that would have cured me forever. Anyway. No, it doesn't mean a thing whatsoever. There is a Gravenhurst in England, and it doesn't mean anything either. Nothing to do with graves, and who knows, eh? So we've got a name, 1862, and very quickly we're going to have or assume a symbol for our community. It's going to be a symbol that will indicate that we have a pretty welcoming nature in Gravenhurst, that we're people who are happy to see anyone who comes to visit. And that is going to be an arch. In 1874, there was actually a photograph, believe it or not, 1874, a photograph taken of an arch, which I believe says, "Welcome Muskoka." To Muskoka maybe might be in there. I think there is a 2 there. Welcome to Muskoka. Anyway, it's relatively close to Sharp Street now, as we know Sharp Street. Sharp Street changed its name from one thing to another, Jubilee Avenue, Victoria Street, but came back to being Sharp Street again. In 1885, why have one arch when you can have 2? So in actual fact, to greet the Governor General, we have 2 arches and a fatted calf, shall we call him, that little white guy down there in the center. I don't know really what his purpose would be. I mean, surely to goodness they didn't suggest to the Governor General that he was going to be eating calf for dinner. But anyway, I guess a white calf being an unusual occurrence would be something to sort of bring out. Lumberman's arches, created at the same relative time, 1885, the one on the left. These are down at the wharf area because we did have a wharf starting in 1875. And so in fact, what you get there are 2 very different, well, not very different, but 2 different representations of a welcome from the lumbermen of Gravenhurst. Lumbering being, as it was, the central industry of Gravenhurst, starting about 1870 and moving on from there through to about 1915 before it began to peter out a bit, and by 1926 was gone. So it's kind of a neat thing to look at. The 2 boats are different, and you can see that, and the sign is different. Industry on the one, on the other, a lumberman's welcome. And in fact, we've even got over here on the right-hand side of the right side picture, we've got a picture of a carriage there. Who knows, could the Governor General have been in it? Wouldn't it be interesting to think that he was? There are pictures of his visit to Gravenhurst taken in the town square, which would be sort of behind the Opera House as we speak, and sort of where the parking lot is, I guess, right now.
You can see the whole ears.
Well, that's nice. Yeah. Yes, and he has them pricked right up, knowing that he's going to be told in a moment to move along. And he's got on some nice little blinders there as well. So in fact, we're just beginning to become a community that can send out a welcome through arches to the people who are coming here. And we have established thus a symbol for Gravenhurst.
Those circular
Big saws.
would be soft, would be circular saw.
Those are big saws. They're saws from, that would be the kind used in a lumber mill. Yeah, so in fact, they're the kind that can take off an arm pretty quickly in a lumber mill, and did in, in many cases. So yeah, they really wanted to represent, I think, what they did as lumbermen. They wanted to say, look at, we've got this lumber, we can build things like this, we can, you know, do all of these kinds of things.
What is the flag on the left?
The flag on the left, yes, of the left-hand picture. It is not really the Canadian, or sorry, the British flag, is it? It's not a Union Jack, and the flag there is not a Union Jack either. So what are they the flags of? Anybody want to make a guess at what they might be associated with? I think they're probably associated with a lumber company, and the lumber company that built this. It doesn't say that anywhere, but that's my guess, that they would have something to do with Mickle Diamond, and they appear to be similar flags, one to the other, on that great building. Never a group to leave well enough alone. We really did like to experiment a little with this idea that we have an arch as our symbol. So in 1925, the one in the bottom center with that little old Model T coming through, that's the original arch as we know it. Now, there may have been others before this, but I don't think so. So I think that the first arch, which is remarkably like the present arch, is it not? Yes. So in fact, but we couldn't leave well enough alone in 1925 and just say, wow, we really like this arch and we're going to stick with it. No. We had to completely revamp it constantly. We rebuilt it, we repainted it, we put different words on it, we did all kinds of things to it, including that stone-clad mess. Oh, do you? Oh, you like that one, eh? Okay, those two pieces of metal or iron that go up the center of each side column were brown, allowed to rust. So they were metal that was allowed to rust. That's the way it looked when I came here. Yeah, 1973.
When did they drop the swastika?
I'm not sure that they actually dropped it per se on the original. Whoops, no, I'm not looking at on that one. It's on this one, and it's there. Can you see it? A swastika did not mean anything negative at all when this would have been done in 1925. In actual fact, it was another representation of a cross. But in fact, of course, we know who perverted it into something quite evil. And as a result, when this particular arch was recreated in modern times in the 1990s, it was recreated without that.
That 1920s one with the two swastikas, that was a very common emblem. It was known as the crooked cross.
Exactly, the crooked cross, yep.
It was on the announcement. The one on the right is reversed, the one on the left.
Yes.
So they're both kind of facing in the 1930s when the Nazis adapted that.
Yes.
Emblem. There were two versions of it. They all faced like the one on the left.
Yeah.
And, newspapers, they were used as around trim.
Exactly.
Borders,
Yeah, borders.
corners,
Absolutely.
on calling cards.
Yep.
Just seen as a very special semi-religious emblem.
Yep. And it looked like a Greek border, actually, when you put them together, touching each other all the way around an object on a piece of paper. It kind of looked like a very nice border. And it wasn't until, of course, in the mid-1930s that it began to be a symbol of something very dire and very much else. And so, in fact, we got rid of it when we recreated that 1925 arch. But you can see how we fooled around with the arch for quite a while. Never a group to leave anything well enough alone. If arches had become our central symbol, steamships started to become central to our identity as well. So by 1865, the first steamship was under construction by Alexander Cockburn, and it was the Winona. built here in Gravenhurst. The other steamships were not built in Gravenhurst, but this one was. And in fact, this was the first steamship to sail on the lakes, and really was our own, with a home port of Gravenhurst, of course. It was really finished in 1866. Steamships then became associated with Gravenhurst in a really major way. And whether or not you were simply coming into Gravenhurst to board the steamship and go on somewhere up the lake or not, it didn't matter, because you had to come here first and get onto the steamship here at the wharf, which had been built and in 1875. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. The picture on the right is a picture of the Anglican Church and its Sunday school, the congregation of the Sunday school, on a steamship going out for a picnic, which I love. You know, that's a wonderful picture. So that's a St. James congregation. The three steamships down here, we've got the Medora, the Muskoka, and this one we can't read. But the three of them would line up in that way, not necessarily those three, on the lake, and put a plank across from one to the other. And you could move people, you know, if they'd gone out on this steamship, but now had to go to a lodge that way, they could then switch over to a different steamship mid-lake. I've always thought, you wouldn't have gotten me to do that. I don't care who you were or where I was going to be going or what was at the end of that trip, not doing it. But you can certainly see the sheer number of people that are boarding steamships and down there. Who knew that in 1887, when the Nipissing was born, that in actual fact, the Nipissing's body, really the hull of it, I guess, would become the underpinning of the oldest operating steam vessel in North America, the Sigwin. And the Sigwin is, in fact, still, I think, the oldest operating steam vessel in North America. Wonderful ship, beautiful ship. But the Nipissing has a sort of an interesting charisma of its own, I think. The lodge behind it up there is called Summit House, which was at Port Colborne. Port Colborne, not Colborne. At the same time as steamships are arising, of course, accommodation has to begin to move into the picture. And it does so before 1865. In fact, it begins in Gravenhurst in 1860, and it includes the first resort built in Muskoka. The first accommodation that was there, this is not the resort, just in case you thought it might be. James and Letitia McCabe were very good-hearted people. They liked people, I think, as well. And so whenever there was some poor solitary walker out there, or two or three, walking the colonization road, which would not have been a road of any substance whatsoever, they would take them in and feed them, give them something to drink, stir around, as they called it, and they would even put them up for the night if they did not have any place to sleep, which of course they wouldn't have had, because 1860, there's nowhere. So you are, you know, kind of on your own with James and Letitia. Thomas Robinson did in fact build what I call the first resort in Muskoka, and it was in Gravenhurst. Thomas Robinson took up, Thomas Robinson, I have to mention, by the way, I've got two absolutely favorite historical figures in Gravenhurst, and Thomas Robinson is one of those two. I had members of his family here in the last year, his granddaughter and other assorted, and we sat down and I was able to show them a sort of a whole picture of Thomas Robinson as he lived his life here. And I was so enthused to do it, and they were in tears. So it was a lovely sort of reminiscence about him and a celebration of his life. He was a wonderful man, I would call him a man of letters, even though he had no education. In fact, he was a reader, a phenomenal reader. When he died, they found he used to build sailboats, and they found his sailboat filled with books, absolutely filled with books, because you can imagine him going out on the lake in his sailboat and you know, having maybe 20 books with him and sort of going, oh, I think I'll read that one today, you know, as I, yes, exactly, while he's sort of, yeah, sitting in a spot somewhere. He was a wonderful man in so many ways. Anyway, and originally he built a log home, And of course, that's what everyone started out with at that time, 1862. But it became then the foundation for the Robinson House, which is the two-story home you see there, built in 1885. He was the man who took in the very first, what we call the first tourists to Muskoka, Campbell and Bain, who were two university students at U of T, who went on, one to become a doctor, the other become a professor. And they were guys who liked to come up here to a wilderness and wander because there was nothing out there, nothing. And so they could wander and explore to their heart's content. And they came upon Thomas Robinson very early in their travels. And he was able to be a guide for them. He was able to, show them all kinds of things that they would never have found on their own. A wonderful man. And then he'd take them back, have his wife feed them and put them up for the night. So wonderful, wonderful man in so many ways. And as I say, one of my two favorites. He had a tract of land that was 100 acres, it was a land grant. And basically, if you think of the point on Muskoka Road, right out to the very end of Muskoka Road, where the old regional center was, or one of the sanatoriums was there before it, his tract of land, his 100 acres, went from that point all the way along the shore of Lake Muskoka, all the way up to, well, whatever 100 acres would have taken in. A phenomenal piece of land. I mean, right along the shoreline. It's said that he donated the land for the two sanatoriums, the Cottage San and the Free Hospital. And it's said that he rued the day that he had done that because, of course, he realized later on just how much money might have been earned by selling off some of that land. But in actual fact, I think he was a generous man in so many ways.
So that is not Muskoka Bay.
That is, that would be roughly where, let me think now where Robinson House was. Micklethwaite took it. I think it's Muskoka Bay. Yeah, I think it's Muskoka. It's probably very close to where the Fire College was. Okay, I mean, it's still there. The buildings are still there. However, it's, yes, not accessible to anybody now. Other well-known tourist accommodation includes some hotels. Now, I don't really look upon them totally as tourist accommodation. Quite often, they were more for people who were working and needed a place to stay while they did so. But we had a Muskoka Bay Hotel. It was built by Edward Cannell. It was built in 1865 and wiped out in 1867. That's typical of what happened to so many buildings. Everything wooden, everything wooden. So there's a steamboat and stage that was built by originally, even though it says Lafreniere and Fraser on there, there is no picture that has the name Steamboat and Stage on it. There's the advertisement for Dougal Brown's Hotel, built in 1867. Choice wine he had. And he eventually sold that hotel on to Fraser and Lafreniere in that order. Cooper's Royal Hotel was built on the site of the TD Hotel, or TD Hotel, the TD Bank, now in Gravenhurst on Muskoka Road. The Cooper Hotel was an interesting one. It was decorated with a number of heads of animals and furs of bears and whatnot. There was a bear kept in the back, piece that's jutting out the back of the hotel. There was a bear kept in there, and you could, once you had had enough to drink in the hotel, go out there and wrestle that bear if you chose to do so. I don't think they gave any guarantees of who would live or die in that situation, but in fact, you could do that. Taylor, George Taylor, wonderful man, built the first, really one of the first lumber mills on Muskoka Bay, George Taylor, but he also built the Albion Hotel in 1879, whereupon his wife said to him, "You'll be selling that hotel very shortly, lest you become its best customer." So in fact, he did turn it over to a man named Wasley very shortly.
Is that on the same site, Judy?
That's on the same site as the Albion Hotel today. Yes, it is. Exactly the same. So the TD Bank site, the Albion. Yes, good question. Thank you. Sharp's Caledonian Hotel and all we have is that drawing of it. There's no actual photograph of it. It was built by James Sharp in 1880. In actual fact, the piece that looks like it's coming around out here was also a general store. So he sort of had a hotel, his own residence, a general store, all kind of attached to each other. And again, it too, like all the others I've been showing you, was destroyed by the Great Fire of 1887. But again, all wooden buildings. We've seen this picture already, but almost as a drawing. But now we're looking at, in fact, what had once been the steamboat and stage, which was built on the corner of Bay Street and Muskoka Road, where the post office is. So that's where it used to be. And then, as I've said, it was sold to Fraser and then sold to Lafreniere. Poor Mr. Lafreniere bought it just before it burned down. He had a lot of bad luck, David Lafreniere did. But in actual fact, quite a beautiful hotel, I think, for its time, you know, quite attractive looking. And, you know, it was very busy. I think it had a well-stocked bar room as well. After the Great Fire, 2 of those 5 hotels that burned down were rebuilt and in brick. One of them being the Albion Hotel, which was rebuilt by a man named Wasley, who would go on to be, along with his descendants, would go on to be, whoops, it's very hot over there, the owner of the Albion Hotel, rebuilt in 1888. And the Caledonian was rebuilt as the Empress, which would go on to become the Gilmore, okay, for those of you who've grown up in Gravenhurst. And so in fact, we're talking about the corner. Well, the building is still there, and it looks, or could look, relatively like that. There's not a lot you'd have to do to it to change it, really. Right on the corner of Sharp Street and Muskoka Road. 1875 was a banner year for Gravenhurst. The railroad came in 1875, and along with that, it remained here and didn't go any farther than here for 10 years. Patrick will attest to how annoyed I'm sure the people north of here might have been by the fact that we got a railroad all to ourselves for 10 years. Imagine building a railroad through Shield Country. I mean, you'd be fine coming along, you know, from Barrie, you're going through farmland and so on. You're getting up to Aurelia's farmland. You're going along, you're getting to Severn Bridge, and you run into the Shield. And before you know it, you're into that. And not for the faint of heart to be building a train, set of train tracks through there. I think the first train station in Gravenhurst was absolutely lovely. Beautiful looking building. There is a steam train coming in, as you can see on the far right of that photograph. People waiting on the platform for it to come in. It looks like some kind of a big bale of something or another waiting to go on it. A very popular train station because, of course, people would be coming from the city to resorts and their cottage homes up here. Even in 1875, there was already the beginnings of a tourist trade. No. Thank you, Lindsay. That's a good question. No, this is actually, for people who know Gravenhurst, if you think about the Anglican cemetery, and then you look from the Anglican cemetery to the west, go back about a block and a half along what's called Main Street, which is back in there, you would probably be close to where that train station was. It was, you know, pretty much in that location.
The first part here is the 3 dormers.
Yes.
Then after that, there's more structure.
Yes.
Is that all?
All belong to the train station. Yeah. Yeah. And I would think that the second building, like the ones that we've got now, would have to do with cargo and a place where you could hold things, especially, although this one, you know, burned down very soon, I'm going to show you. But in fact, you had to have a place where you could store things that were coming in for settlers and so on until they could come and get the gear that they had ordered or wanted. And so, in fact, that would be part of that. And there, ladies and gentlemen, is, of course, what happens to another beautiful wooden building in 1913. This is a Gallatin photograph. He took wonderful photos of Gravenhurst. And in fact, we owe him a tremendous debt for all of the pictures that we have in the archives taken by him. Look at all the people who are down in the immediate neighborhood of the fire. I'm wondering why, but perhaps they're getting off the train and coming up, because it looks to me as though one of those train cars has done something very unusual and is sort of almost at right angles to the tracks. But then we've got people who come out to watch the fire. I mean, you get your entertainment where you can, so, you come out and watch the building burn. The new train station couldn't be built. The train station couldn't be replaced until the end of the First World War. So in actual fact, it couldn't be opened then until 1919. Now, the man who would be king and then wouldn't be king opened the train station at that time. So he was Prince Edward still in 1919, and he's shaking the hands of returned First World War soldiers. He's shaking hands with his left hand. Everybody notice that? He's shaking hands. It's not a reverse negative. He has, in fact, a very sore right hand because he has been traveling across Canada and has been shaking hands from one end of the country to the other. And at this point, he tells these poor gentlemen here, I'm sorry, guys, but I'm going to have to shake hands with you with my left. It's the only one left working.
It looks like he's got a walking stick as well.
He does have a walking stick. Now, I don't think that would necessarily mean that he would need a walking stick so much as it would be part of the apparel of a gentleman at the time. Yes, yes. So no doubt it's made of ebony or something lovely. He does, yes. He may, in fact, he's sort of standing with one leg kind of raised there. So that one might be an operative stick, but the other one I think is strictly for looks. Muskoka Wharf also had train tracks built to it, not just the train station up where the bulk of the people were living, but in actual fact, they put a spur line down to the wharf in 1875. And so that was the place now where trains could meet with steamships. And this is, a wonderful thing that happens, because if you look at the crowds in each of these pictures, you can see it much more clearly in the colored one, the crowds that are moving between train and steamer. This was the place where people simply went from one to the other, depending upon whether they were going home or going out on the lakes to wherever it was they wanted to be, resorts or their own properties out there. But that wharf was built to take the steamships. And then, in fact, the train tracks came down to the wharf and allowed the trains to go right onto the wharf. You didn't really have to take very many steps between your train and your ship. A couple of quick steps across and you're on the other. We had to keep it convenient. Gravenhurst had more and more and more things happening to it and going for it. And in this case, I'm going to mention industry for a moment rather than the people in tourism. Gravenhurst became the center of the lumber industry in Muskoka from about 1870 to about 1926. Now I'm saying 1926, which is a little elongated because that's when Charles Mickle closed his last mill. But the first mill was built in 1870. And then the last mill really died in 1926. The height of the lumber industry came very quickly after the first mill was built. And as a result of that, we had 14 lumber mills on Muskoka Bay. Now, I don't know about you, but thinking about the sound of, you saw those big saws? The sound of those whirring from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, times 14, times 3 more on Gull Lake, times 2 more on Bryden's Bay, we're talking 19 lumber mills, all working really in what we now Gravenhurst. And in actual fact, all of them whirring away, employing hundreds and hundreds of men. There wouldn't be a surprise, I think, to anyone to understand that some of these mills literally employed 100 men, others of them 50, 20, and so on, depending on the size of the mill. And there were, in my lumbering talk, I talked about the specific mills and so on.
Did people think of Sawdust City as a derogatory term? Or?
I think it would depend on where you lived. I'm sure it would have been derogatory if you were living in Bracebridge at the time. But if you were living in Gravenhurst at the time, I don't think we did. I think in actual fact, it probably was almost like a shout out to the fact that this was what our people were employed in doing. And I don't think anybody felt in any way sort of negative about that. It attracted so many people to come here and work in the lumber mills that the population just soared as soon as those lumber mills started opening in succession, one after the other. 1870 was the first one. It was Peter Coburn, Alexander Coburn's father, who opened that one. And that's because he'd gotten a contract to plank the colonization road. So in 1870, he's got this, he's got this contract, and he's got to come up with all these planks in order to plank the road. So he opens the first sawmill, and then from there it is just, chaos as more and more and more lumber mills open. They open and they change hands, they burn down, they built back up again. It's a very fluid situation for a number of years. And I'd say the heyday of all of that was probably sometime around 1915 or 16, with Charles Mickle going on with a couple of others until 1926. Charles Mickle was the premier lumber baron, and a man that I credit with being perhaps one of the two most important men in Gravenhurst history, along with maybe Thomas Robinson.
So the distribution of the lumber, how far would it go? Do you know that?
Yeah, we do. We have all kinds of information in some of the, there were journals that were printed for practically every business you could conceive of. There were grocery journals, and there were dry goods journals, and there were things called the Canadian Lumberman or Canada Lumberman. And in fact, they would record shipments of lumber and where they went to and how much the lumber was selling for and so on. And I think they were published, generally speaking, once a month, although for a while there, I think it was a little more frequent and became once a week. But in fact, you could take a look and see what Charles Mickle was making on any given week or month, and everybody would know very quickly that he was making one heck of a lot of money. But then so were others as well. But yes, we have, we can look and see. It was being shipped to Toronto, it was being shipped to the United States as well. But Toronto being a booming, growing city at this time, I mean, it could eat up lumber faster than you could imagine.
Sure.
And I mean, to say nothing of the fact that in Muskoka, we were building all kinds of buildings as well. And at this time, by the time we had 14 lumber mills going, we had a population of about 2,000 people. Pretty amazing.
And was the width from here all the way from the top?
Well, that's the thing. That's kind of why it petered out eventually, and not too far after. Eventually, or initially, it was cut around us. And what you would look at if you saw a picture of some of the landscapes, they didn't ever cut them down at the ground level, of course. That's a lot of extra work. So you cut them off sort of knee high, right? And you've got just stumps as far as the eye can see, all of them knee high. But in actual fact, it wasn't long before they'd cut everything here. They would ship it. They would send it down chutes into the lake, and then it would come down in the spring on the thawing water and come into Gravenhurst Bay or Muskoka Bay. But in actual fact, eventually it was being cut far enough away, but still on the watershed, that you could actually move it by using the rivers like the Muskoka River and so on, and still get it to Gravenhurst. Once we kind of had cut ourselves out of wood, I think that was the point at which they started to move farther afield, and no longer was it local wood, and it wouldn't be shipped here to be processed. It would be processed where it was being cut, so North Bay or somewhere like that. That's not the biggest log jam I've ever seen, but it's not bad. Muskoka Bay in West Gravenhurst was so jammed with logs that they said, this was actually a quotation, that you could walk from one shore to another without getting a drop of water on your shoes. And in fact, they talked about little girls even doing that. Now, I think about logs and the way they move when you're walking on them. My husband's father was a logger, and he did exactly that. He cut logs and rode them into a bay and so on. And I think to myself, if I were, if it was my little girl, she'd be over my knee faster than you could say, no more. Okay, so we've talked about the beginning of the tourism. We've talked about the logging industry. Time to talk as well about the fact that the climate in Muskoka and in Gravenhurst particularly was considered to be health-giving. In actual fact, we supposedly had pure water, clean air. It was, we didn't have fever here. We didn't have ague, which is sort of the flu. We didn't have, if people came here, they had immediate relief from bronchial, throat, and nasal troubles. Okay, I'm not sure who wrote that, but in actual fact, somebody was probably hoping to make money off tourism of some kind. But in actual fact, I mean, I'm sure to some degree that was probably true, particularly when you think of the industrial age in Toronto, which is heating up, and how awful that would be for the people living in places that they had no idea would become so badly polluted. And so, in fact, coming up here would feel like God-given relief after having been in a pretty rank atmosphere in the city. But it's not a surprise then when you discover that we, in fact, became the center for one of the life-saving sort of treatments. Actually, it really wasn't, but in actual fact, William Gage went across the country, crisscrossed the country, trying to find a place to open a sanatorium for the treatment of tuberculosis. He was a man who was a philanthropist. He had made a lot of money, and he felt very, very strongly, he had a very strong Methodist streak, felt very strongly that you had to address something that was killing off the population left and right. So in actual fact, he's traveling across, he's got a little entourage with him, and they go from city to city, town to town, across Canada and back again, looking for a place to open a sanatorium for tuberculosis treatment. And everywhere he goes, they say, not in my backyard. Not in my back. No TB coming here. We don't have TB in our community, which would have been a lie in so many places. But in actual fact, we don't want anybody bringing it here either. So in actual fact, you can imagine how gobsmacked he must have been when Charles Mickle, my hero, approached him and said, how would you like a site for free? A good road to the site, which we will build for you, and $10,000 towards the building of the first sanatorium. I'm sure, without a doubt, that Gage must have felt like falling to his knees and screaming hallelujah, because this is just not the kind of reception he'd had from anyone else. So in actual fact, William Gage, not a man to dilly-dally, opened the first sanatorium for the treatment of tuberculosis in Canada. And he opened it in Gravenhurst in 1897, and that's because of Charles Mickle. It was very short time after that Gage said to himself, it's all very well to treat the people who will pay a few dollars a week for their treatment, which they would, but what about all the poverty-stricken people who have tuberculosis in the cities and towns and countryside, and they can't afford to pay? There's got to be a free hospital. There has to be. And so what does he do? He sets the National Sanatorium Association onto the idea of building a free hospital for the treatment of tuberculosis. And why not in Gravenhurst when you've already got that reputation and you've got some specialists here and so on? The first free hospital for the treatment of tuberculosis in the world. I think that that's something that just makes me absolutely so proud. Yeah. By the time 1915 had rolled around, we had 4 TB sanatoriums here, treating literally thousands of people and soldiers who came back from World War I with trench lung, tuberculosis, all the things you would pick up when you're cheek by jowl in trenches. They're standing in water up to their knees. I mean, you don't even want to think about what those men went through. Anyway, we ended up with a Calidor sanatorium, which I'm going to show you here in a moment. And it took care of soldiers. This is the first sanatorium built in Canada for the treatment of TB. It was called Muskoka Cottage Hospital or Sanatorium. That was the main building, and they called it the main. There's the bus arriving with a new load of perhaps patients. And in actual fact, It was absolutely beautiful. You can see one of the cottages on the photograph on the left-hand side, but on the right side of that photograph, you can see one of the cottages. They looked like that, and they were beautiful. They were endowed by well-to-do families, and not for their own purposes. In other words, they didn't have necessarily a relative who was going to stay there, but this would have been the kind of charitable act that would have earned them, what will we call them, brownie points? You know, the goodwill of people. In actual fact, there were both endowed beds and endowed cottages at the sanatorium. It was built in 1897, and in fact, a set of circumstances, which I'll mention in a moment, came to bear such that the next building that went in was the Gage building in 1920, and that's this big hospital-like building at the bottom. Why that didn't become the hospital in Muskoka after TB was no longer an issue, I can only guess. But in fact, it didn't. But there was this fantastic, very much a hospital-like looking building that was built in 1920, and in 1960 would go on to become the regional center. It still stands down there today. If you go online and you Google the regional center, you will be disgusted and dismayed at the fact that it has been allowed to sit there since 1992, with now plants and mold growing out of the walls and floors, and it is completely blocked off to any kind of access. It is a horror, and it is a sin.
Is it owned by the community?
Oh no, it's owned by the government of Ontario. Oh yeah, we've got a few. We've got two of them here. So this is one of them, you know. I mean, look at the incredible look of that sanatorium, and then that wonderful hospital building, which could have been the Muskoka Hospital. Gage, of course, as I said, felt there needed to be a hospital for the treatment of the poor. And so in fact, in 1902, the original building up here on the left-hand side, and then the added to building, which in fact treated both the consumptive poor and a number of soldiers coming back eventually from the First World War. And they eventually planted a garden in that big lawn area in front of the building there. That would house a garden that some of the patients in better condition could work in, and grow vegetables and so on for the use of the people in the hospital. That free hospital would go on to become the Ontario Fire College, which was opened in 1957 and closed in 2021, the first residential fire college in Canada and the second in North America. It was without a doubt an incredible property. I worked there for 20 years and loved every minute of it, but the property was absolutely beautiful. It today is also fenced off, barricaded off, gated off, and closed to the public. And it too is probably suffering the same fate as the regional center has suffered, which will mean mold and plants growing out of the walls and so on.
I know somebody who, they used to come up here and train.
Oh, yes.
the firefighters.
Yes, yes. We trained thousands and thousands and thousands of firefighters from across Canada, or Ontario, and some from across Canada. Mainly they were officers, not firefighters per se. The firefighters came in the summertime for the summer weeks when they could use the burn buildings. But during the rest of the year, it was fire officers who are, in fact, people who are working in business for all intents and purposes. So they were taking courses in management, training, all kinds of skill sets that any manager would require to manage any kind of a large corporation. Toronto Fire Department, you can only imagine the size of their budget and the size of their corporation. And you know, you would have training officers, fire chiefs, deputy fire chiefs coming from all the fire departments in Ontario. We also had them coming from Bermuda. We had some from England, although they have a very fine residential fire college in England as well. Back to sanatoriums again, we just quickly visited the Ontario Fire College there, but it too was a sanatorium originally. Eventually, we had two more sanatoriums to add to our treatment centers. The Minnewaska, which had been a small hotel, you see that on the left-hand side, and then enlarged to become briefly a TB sanatorium. It was enlarged by Charles Parfitt, Dr. Charles Parfitt, because he had in his mind's eye a sanatorium that would cater to the well-to-do, and they would be paying mucho buckos for their treatment, unlike the other people that were coming. But he started off with the Minnewaska as a sort of a stopgap until he could build the Calidor. You can't tell from these photographs, but the Calidor was gray with a pink roof and was meant to be, as I say, for the well-to-do, people who could really pay their way. Eventually, it was enlarged, and so on to admit World War I soldiers. And they were told they had to take them because they had thought they were going to be taking in, the well-to-do. But in actual fact, the government said, no, you'll be taking World War I soldiers with all kinds of lung diseases and so on. We also were home to, among all the other things that have made us special, the only opera house in Muskoka, and one of the few in Ontario that remained as an opera house and didn't just become a town hall or get torn down or become something other than what we have here, which is Gravenhurst Opera House, built in 1901 by Charles Mickle. Well, he was the mayor. He was the man who thought it would be a really good idea because our town hall had burned down in 1897. And so in fact, he thought, we definitely need a town hall. So let's get busy. And it was an opera house that he and Emma conceived of, I think. The opera house, as I say, was built in 1901. That's a lovely shot of it there. It's a very early shot of it. The two maples that are in the front would have gone along with the maples that ran down the side on Sharp Street and were in fact planted all along the side of the street. And that's the opening night in March of the Opera House, and all of those little people we have names for. Some of the names still are here.
Was that the Carnegie Library?
Give me 2 seconds. No, yes, it was. Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, of course it was. In 1923, the Carnegie Library was built. I was thinking of Mechanics Institute. Yeah, the Carnegie Library was the last library to be built under the funds of the Carnegie Foundation, and it was the smallest library ever to be built under. And it's only because in about I'm going to say 1910-ish, Gravenhurst applied for funds from the Carnegie Foundation. And the Carnegie Foundation said, yes, we'll give you $7,000, which at that time would have been quite a bit. And all you have to do is conform to the following 4 or 5, things, provisos that you'll have to do. And the council, couldn't decide on a site. It should be on my site and I'll sell it to you. No, it should be on my site and I'll sell it to you. So yeah, and couldn't decide on a whole bunch of things, such that finally the council did it in, because in fact, when they went back to the Carnegie Foundation in 1922 and said, could we have those funds that you promised us about 15 years ago? They said, oh, I'm sorry, that's all wrapped up. Now we do have a few bucks lying around in there. Let's take a look. Oh, well, we've got $7,000, which now, of course, isn't going to build much of anything. And in fact, we'll give you that. So in fact, we got the leftovers, if you like, from the, yeah, it was ever this.
Where's the Carnegie Library?
Well, it still exists. It's sitting right beside the Opera House, but on Muskoka Road. Beautiful little building with cream colored trim on red brick. And it's where the Chamber of Commerce and the Service Ontario and all that is in there. Yeah.
Are you using that for the archives as well?
No, the archives are in the library, in the public library. Yeah. That opera house went on to become a pretty important spot. Not only was it able to provide entertainment from traveling groups, vaudeville entertainers and whatnot, who came on a sort of a road circuit in Ontario, in Canada, and the US. It also provided amateur theater. It provided a venue for children and so on. And in fact, it became the center of the rebirth of a Canadian live theater, Canadian being the word, and the first home, along with Port Carling, of professional summer theater. And so, in fact, you recognize the man who is on the right. Yeah, he was one of the men who began as a stage carpenter actually, and did that for a couple of summers, and then I think said, or somebody said, gee, you know, you might like to act in one of these, and sure enough, he did. Yep. So he started out here. Yeah, and you can see the list there. Some of those people are unknown to people outside of Canada, but Honor Blackman isn't. She was the Bond girl in Goldfinger, the Gold Girl. Jackie Burroughs, Robertson Davies, Timothy Findlay, Megan Follows, Graham Greene, all were here in Gravenhurst at this opera house. You've lost me?
Yeah, I think the power's out. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Anyway, he was operating. He had maybe no gloves at that point and had an infected finger and died from infection. the National Historic Site has been painted for a variety of colors, so many different greens that it's hard to keep track. I never know when I drive past it what green I'm going to see, but in actual fact, it's a beautiful, beautiful home and well worth your visit if you've never gone there. He redesigned all kinds of medical and surgical instruments, and in the accompanying building, they have all kinds of photographs and real instruments that he was involved with. Yeah, he was quite a man. And that's him sitting on the horse with his dad. All of these guys, many of them in partial uniform, looking, nose in the air. Yes, we are going to take over the world. And in fact, heading off to that camp held a maximum, I think, really of 500 enemy combatants, mainly German officers and their staff. Once the first year was over, it was almost totally an officers' camp. And then their cooks, their batmen, so on, who were, enlisted men. That TV sanatorium became the prisoner of war. 500 POWs in our town, many of them being given, because they were officers and gentlemen, the right to actually go out and walk around. Surprised the heck out of people who were picking blueberries and come over a hill, and there's somebody in either partial or full Nazi uniform and picking blueberries as well. Anyway, that's what it looked like when you arrived from the train station. The photograph of the top left was never allowed to be taken. It was taken by Henry Fry and published in the Toronto Star the day after they arrived. In actual fact, all photographers and users, there will be no publication of photographs of Nazi and will never identify where they are going. Well, anybody who was a tourist in Gravenhurst recognized the corner of Bay Street and Muskoka Road. And if you couldn't recognize that, because in fact, that corner has all these kind of, anyway, really past it and looking. They did leave us a legacy of some good things. One of them being the stone wall and the stone steps, which they designed as part of a landscape design done by all of these officers. Had wonderful skills coming from all over the place, and one of them was actually a landscape designer, and so he designed park, he designed the steps, and then they actually built them. You could not force an officer to do any work whatsoever, only enlisted men. So in actual fact, these officers did that on their own. It has just doing so. At that same time, we had Norway in Gravenhurst. And as a result of having the Norway and the 2,500 Norwegian airmen who would be trained here, we got Prince Olaf and his wife here more than once, actually. They actually stayed at, oh dear, now a nursing home. Oh, Penny, help me out. Yeah. Yep, on the main street. That's where they stayed when they came here to visit. And yeah, I think lovely people. Interesting movie made recently about supposedly her relationship with the United States. But in actual fact, I take anything that comes from there as just totally to bring us all. Who knows? Anyway, 3,595 Norwegian personnel were involved. So in some cases, they trained and then became trainers and so on. And the Norwegian and Canadian governments created a memorial at the airport where they trained. So that was a very, I think, a very wonderful part of our history. We had all those Scandinavian settlers that had come here back in the early 1800s. And in actual fact, some of them actually worked at the Norway camp as cooks and, all kinds of things. And because they were often either Norwegian, it was Swede time that they lived in Gravenhurst, but they weren't Swedes. They were either Norwegians or Danes. And in fact, they could speak the language of some of these men. Some of these men also spoke English very well, and some of them were Gravenhurst girls, and certainly turned up at Gravenhurst dances during the time they were here. Can you imagine the girls in Gravenhurst while these men were all away at war, and they thought suddenly, well, 100 airmen in uniform coming to dance with them. Some of them were men. There they are standing on the that barn. Anyway, as I say, 2,500 trained here. Finish up your coffee, and then we're going to go over and drop rotten tomatoes on the POWs in the POW camp. Wouldn't that be a fun thing to do if you were a Norwegian pilot being trained here? That varies. They would leave behind a legacy of buildings, which eventually would go on to form the basis for another one. Of course, I'm not as fond of this one, but the basis for prisons in Gravenhurst. And so, in fact, some of the original buildings were used as Beaver Creek was opening up in '61 as a minimum security prison. Then Fembert joined in 1998. The two amalgamated or merged in 2014. And so they became a combination minimum and medium security prison. It says that they basically have 800 inmates and 400 staff. It is a place where more areas. In fact, even though I'm not overly fond of having prisons, I lived in Kingston for a number of years and went to university there, and I was never fond of the idea that if there was an escape, we were all vulnerable. And certainly there's always been escapes from prisons. So yeah, it's kind of a regular thing. February and we usually get them back fairly quickly, but not always. That's what the prison complex looks like. And I think it's a wonderful piece of art that it's really close to the. So if you've got fires, they can, in fact, just hop over a fence and pick up a plane over there. But in actual fact, that is what prison complex is. No more about incarceration, POWs, or we're going to look at one last wonderful thing of Gravenhurst, and that was music on the road. In August of 1949, this advertisement appeared in the Gravenhurst Banner, and basically said there's going to be a show on the 23rd and the 24th of August. It's going to, it's going to be a true vaudeville live. Have comedy, and it will be done on a floating stage on Gull Lake. So there's the start, 1949, music on the barge. I think it's amazing that we've had that venue for so long. Entertainment in the open air. There are more pictures than one that look like that, where little pieces of grass where people have finally left and gone back to the city. But generally speaking, that's a crowd that extends as far as the eye can see, and they're all there to see the entertainment on the barge. There are always children playing in the sand and the water at the edge, unless it was into September and a little too cool for that. There were boats that would pull up and listen to the music and so on. It's always been a wonderful venue. Toronto attempted to do the same thing. The city of Toronto thought it was a great idea too. And I can't remember the name of the park. Anyway, when they were going to try this, they had a body of it. It didn't work. No, it wasn't High Park. It was, I keep thinking something to do with Fusilier or something, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But they tried. And even though it was sort of sporadic, in actual fact, the whole barge and venue thing was completely enhanced and redone. And Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to be on a tour and were invited to come and open the barge, which they did on the 4th of July, 1959. Many of you will know the story of the city. After Prince Philip's you, she's 9. He said, "Oh, I have the same age." And she said, "Well, why didn't you bring her?" Yep. That's going on Sydney. Anyway. But there's a picture of Queen and the King, the Prince, who would never ever be or you can only imagine they'd be covered with bulletproof glass and so on. But thousands of people turned out to see them. And I think because she'd only been queen at that point, it would have been for about 6 years. She probably thought this was a pretty fun kind of thing to do, And she was on a little tour. She went to Torrance next, and then up to Paris and got on. There's a royal yacht. Anyway, there it is. There's the barge as it appears today, and here it is. And there is installed seating by the Gravenhurst Rotary Club. Gravenhurst Rotary Club could ever imagine. I mean, if we start looking at so many things that have been built and done Gravenhurst, we can go straight to the heart of the river, especially when we go from that river. And that sort of brings us to that seating was completed last year. From 49 to 59, not, there were, it was intermittent in those years. I think it really depended on who was running it, who was in charge of programming, what they could get and couldn't get, and so on. But generally speaking, it ran pretty consistently in that 10-year period. When I say that Gravenhurst has a history like that, we don't have much. And which was something that was in every community in Ontario. But there were arches going into every community. Now you could probably count them on one hand. The number of arches that exist. And we have a beautiful one. We had the first steamship. We have the Seagull. The steam operating vessel. We had the first train, the first wharf. We had Sawdust City, which, good or bad as you might think of it, I think of it in a very positive light. Wow, lucky. We had the first resort, first tourist in Tampa. We had and have now the house in Muskoka, and so many opera houses in Ontario. If you look up opera houses, like the one in St. Mary's, for example, beautiful opera, made of stone, right on the water, and became a flower mill. You know, somewhere along the line in its history, because it just couldn't support an opera house. In actual fact, yes, our opera house was, you know, it was the town council chambers, it was part was it did do other things. It was the bank for a while when the new bank was being built, the TD Bank. But in actual fact, it's always been the opera house. It's never been called the town hall and left at that. It's always been called the opera house. We had not only the first TV stand in Canada, but the first free stand in the world. We have the only National Historic Site in Muskoka. We had a prisoner of war camp for officers, German officers, who in fact, maybe not a positive thing, but in actual fact, I guess it was, because we employed a whole host of people as a result of that POW camp. And after the war was over in a few years, when things had settled down, I think a number of those German POWs came back to Canada to live. We had Little Norway, which again contributed so much to for better or worse, we've got and music on the march. Anything there that sort of yes, ma'am. Here's a yes, yes.